On a cold autumn evening in the 14th century, the wedding celebration of a young couple did not end with music or feasting, but instead reached its climax in the crowded bedroom where privacy was considered unnecessary. The ritual known as the bedding ceremony turned the marital bed into a stage for the entire village, where neighbors, relatives, and friends claimed their right to witness the proof of consummation. The bride and groom were often dragged playfully but firmly toward their chamber, stripped of their clothing by laughing guests, and laid beneath the coarse blankets while bawdy songs filled the smoky air. Outside the door, a noisy crowd gathered, pressing their ears against the thin wooden walls, waiting for the cries or laughter that would confirm the act had taken place. In some regions, people demanded visible evidence, insisting that bloodied sheets be displayed in the morning as a token of the bride's virginity and the marriage's legitimacy. This ritual was not merely entertainment, but a serious public duty. The union was considered incomplete until the community had its assurance. A woman's chastity was her dowry, her family's honor stitched into every fiber of those linen sheets, and failure to provide the expected sign could mean disgrace or annulment. For the bride, barely more than a child in many cases, the ordeal carried a crushing weight of expectation, her trembling body judged not only by her husband, but by dozens of eager spectators who treated intimacy as communal property. The husband, too, bore pressure, for his virility and reputation as a man depended on his ability to perform under the scrutiny of his peers, who jeered, laughed, and shouted encouragements through the cracks in the door. This strange public theater reveals how in the medieval world, sex was never purely private. It was a transaction tied to land, livestock, and alliances, a performance that intertwined faith, family, and survival. The act of consummation became evidence in a social contract, binding two families together, securing inheritance rights, and protecting property claims. The bedding ceremony, with its mixture of merriment and menace, blurred the lines between celebration and humiliation, leaving little space for tenderness or genuine affection. In villages where everyone knew each other's secrets, the details of a wedding night traveled quickly, carried on whispers from those who stood closest to the chamber door. The bride's cry of pain or silence, the groom's confidence or hesitation, the presence or absence of blood on the morning sheets, all became matters of gossip that shaped reputations for years to come. It was an intimate performance where the audience refused to leave until they were satisfied, their laughter mingling with the sobs of a frightened girl or the triumphant roar of a boastful man. For the couple, the night symbolized the beginning of a life together, but it also marked their surrender to communal authority, a reminder that even in the most personal of moments, their bodies did not belong solely to themselves. In this world of rigid customs and relentless social pressure, the marriage bed became a battlefield of expectation, where family honor could be lost with a single drop of blood too few, and where a young bride's future depended not on love or affection, but on her ability to satisfy the collective gaze of her community. In the medieval world, the idea of a wife belonging to herself simply did not exist, for marriage was not a union of equals, but a transfer of ownership from father to husband, sealed by oaths, livestock, and land. A woman's body was considered property, her consent irrelevant, her desires silenced beneath the heavy weight of custom and law. The phrase marital rape had no meaning because intimacy was defined not as a matter of choice, but as a duty owed by the wife to her master. If he reached for her in the dead of night, whether she was weary, ill, or terrified, she had no recognized right to refuse him, and refusal could invite punishment, humiliation, or even accusations of sin. Domestic violence was not merely tolerated, but expected as a husband's tool for maintaining order, his right to discipline his wife viewed as natural as his right to plow his fields or harvest his crops. The Church, which claimed to protect souls, reinforced this hierarchy by preaching that obedience was a woman's path to salvation, and that submission, even in suffering, brought her closer to God. Sermons reminded her that Eve's disobedience had cursed all women, and every act of compliance was interpreted as an act of penance for ancient guilt. Priests in confession asked probing questions about whether wives had resisted their husbands, and any hint of reluctance was portrayed as rebellion against both man and God. Legal codes echoed the same message, granting husbands authority over every aspect of their wives' lives, from clothing to movement to the rhythm of their most private moments. A bride might enter her new household carrying her dowry and her father's blessing, but she quickly discovered that she was expected to yield in silence, her body a tool for procreation, her lack of voice regarded as proof of virtue. In villages, this expectation was so absolute that neighbors rarely questioned a man's treatment of his wife. Bruises or broken bones were seen not as crimes, but as lessons, whispered about only if they threatened family alliances or disrupted social order. Gossip could condemn a woman far faster than any court, and silence was often her only shield. A husband's power was written into contracts, blessed by priests and enforced by the watchful eyes of the community, leaving a woman with almost no refuge from demands made upon her day or night. Marriage was not imagined as companionship, but as control, a binding chain that defined a woman's value in terms of obedience and fertility. Some chronicles and scattered letters mention wives seeking help from mothers, midwives, or wise women, who might advise them on herbs to dull pain, charms to soften a husband's temper, or whispered rituals to shield them from cruelty. Yet such help was secret, fragile, and often condemned as superstition or even witchcraft. A woman who reached too openly for relief risked harsher punishment, for independence of any kind was viewed as dangerous. The terrifying reality was that a wife's body was never hers to command, and the notion of personal choice and intimacy would have seemed incomprehensible to most of her contemporaries. For many young brides, the wedding night was not the beginning of affection, but the first lesson in submission, taught in whispers of duty and cries muffled behind thin cottage walls. Over time, some women carved small spaces of survival, perhaps negotiating moments of rest when a husband was drunk, or gaining sympathy from a mother-in-law who remembered her own suffering. Others endured silently, their stories lost in the routine of hardship that defined their days. Yet within this suffocating system, women found ways to share strength, through friendship, through storytelling, and through the hidden knowledge passed from generation to generation. The medieval home, dark and crowded, gave little opportunity for privacy, but within its narrow walls, resilience was quietly born. Women supported each other during childbirth, whispered advice on managing men's tempers, and offered comfort to those crushed beneath the weight of their husband's authority. Their lives remind us that intimacy, as we understand it today, was once defined not by mutual desire, but by ownership and power. What we might now call love was often reshaped into endurance, and what we might call partnership was reduced to hierarchy. In this world of rigid custom and relentless expectation, a wife was at once honored as a bearer of children and diminished as a possession, cherished for her fertility, yet denied the dignity of choice. Her struggle was constant, her courage often invisible, and her story rarely told in chronicles dominated by male voices. Yet, if we look closely, through scattered testimonies and fragments of folklore, we glimpse not only suffering but also survival, the quiet resistance of women who carried their burdens with remarkable strength. Their lives remind us that the concept of freedom within marriage is a painfully modern achievement, hard-won after centuries when a wife's body was considered little more than her husband's unquestioned property. In the medieval imagination, the marriage bed was not simply a place for closeness, but a battlefield where salvation itself was at stake, and the rules that governed intimacy were as rigid as stone walls surrounding a fortress, because the church had declared that passion, left unchecked, could drag souls into eternal damnation. So from pulpit to confession booth, priests and theologians drew up an intricate calendar of prohibitions, reminding couples that intercourse was forbidden during seasons of Lent and Advent, on holy feast days, on Fridays devoted to Christ's suffering, on Sundays reserved for worship, and even on certain Wednesdays when purity was demanded, meaning that if a husband and wife followed every restriction, they were left with little more than 50 permitted nights in a year to share their bed. And even then, they were watched not by eyes, but by conscience, sharpened by fear. The very position of their bodies mattered, for St. Jerome had warned that excessive affection between spouses was adulterous, and Thomas Aquinas, writing in his great Summa Theologica in the 13th century, decreed that the only acceptable form was the so-called missionary pose, man above and woman beneath, face to face, reflecting divine order with the male ruling and the female submitting, while any other arrangement, whether the woman on top or the couple joined from behind, was branded unnatural, animalistic, or a sin that could echo in eternity. Oral contact of any kind was condemned as vile corruption. Intimacy during menstruation was said to spread poison, and touching during pregnancy or breastfeeding was forbidden because it might harm the child or weaken the soul. And so every desire, every instinct was weighed against the terror of sin. Imagine the tension for a young bride who, still trembling from the rough laughter of the bedding ceremony, now had to memorize which days were safe, which moments might condemn her, and whether resisting her husband on a forbidden Wednesday was more dangerous than yielding and risking eternal fire, for in her world, refusal could bring bruises and rage, but obedience could bring damnation, and no priest would comfort her with the idea of choice. Confession became a place of interrogation, where women whispered to a stern cleric about when and how they had lain with their husbands, and where a man could be chastised for showing too much tenderness to his wife, because even love was treated as suspect if it strayed into pleasure. The irony was suffocating, because marriage was celebrated as sacred, yet its most private act was hemmed in with such suspicion that joy itself seemed criminal. And still couples found ways to bend or break the rules, whispering in candlelight, testing limits, or hiding their laughter behind thin walls. For desire has always refused to be caged, but for many, fear triumphed, and intimacy became another form of penance, a ritual performed not for closeness but for duty, timed like the tolling of church bells, measured against fasting days and holy feasts, leaving wives and husbands anxious, watchful, and often alienated from their own longings. The very architecture of belief turned passion into a ledger of sins, and the bed into a courtroom where angels and demons stood unseen, recording each movement, each sigh, each forbidden caress. And so, medieval couples lived in a paradox, bound by vows meant to sanctify love, yet shackled by teachings that treated pleasure as peril. Their nights haunted not by romance, but by the fear that the wrong gesture, the wrong moment, or the wrong day could turn an act of union into a ticket to hell. A reminder that in that world, the body was never free, the soul was never safe, and intimacy was a gamble played under the watchful gaze of eternity. In the medieval world, where faith and fear ruled every corner of daily existence, the Church's endless restrictions on when and how a man and wife could lie together created a strange arithmetic of desire, and if each prohibition was obeyed with strict devotion, the result was a calendar that allowed no more than 50 nights in the span of an entire year for lawful intimacy, a number so small that it transformed the marriage bed into a place of rare permission rather than constant companionship, and this limitation shaped not only physical closeness, but the rhythm of family life itself. Imagine a young wife, scarcely more than a girl, counting days on her fingers, whispering questions to her mother, desperate to remember which weeks of Lent demanded abstinence, which feast days were holy, which Fridays carried prohibitions, and how the moon and church bells dictated the boundaries of her body, until she realized that nearly every day seemed to belong not to her husband or herself, but to priests and saints who had drawn invisible lines across her marriage. The permitted nights became weighted with expectation, as if each one had to carry the burden of an entire month's longing, so that what might have been a gentle encounter often grew into a test of duty, performance, and fear, because both husband and wife believed that mistakes in timing could summon eternal punishment. A man who reached for his wife on the wrong evening might be convinced that he had endangered not only his own soul, but hers, and the woman who yielded might later weep in confession, torn between guilt for surrendering and terror of her husband's anger if she refused. In such an atmosphere, passion was reduced to obligation, closeness to calculation, and the natural warmth of desire was chilled by the constant shadow of sin, for couples were taught that excessive eagerness, even within marriage, carried the taint of adultery, and that pleasure was dangerous unless carefully rationed by the clock of heaven. This peculiar rationing also meant that fertility itself was shaped by the church, because with so few permitted nights, the chances of conception were uncertain, and so families desperate for heirs sometimes begged priests for exceptions, though rarely received them, while others turned to secret folk practices, herbs, and whispered charms to tilt the odds in their favor. Yet even these acts of quiet rebellion were laced with anxiety, for discovery could lead to condemnation, gossip, or even accusations of witchcraft. Thus, the calculation of 50 days per year became more than a number. It became a symbol of how completely the private world of husband and wife was invaded by external authority, how even their most intimate acts were measured, judged, and disciplined by forces beyond their control. And still, within this tight cage, human hearts beat with longing, and many couples, whether peasants in smoky cottages or nobles in stone castles, found ways to break the rules, to steal moments of tenderness on forbidden days, to risk their souls for the sake of love or lust, proving again that no calendar, no decree, no tally of 50 nights could ever fully extinguish the oldest flame of human desire. In the medieval imagination, the female body was never seen as a separate and complete creation, but as a flawed reflection of the male form, a shadow cast by divine design that failed to meet perfection. And so, physicians, scholars, and priests insisted that a woman was essentially an imperfect man, her anatomy described not with curiosity or respect, but with disdain, for they wrote in thick Latin texts that her genitals were nothing more than a penis turned inward, her ovaries described as hidden testicles, her womb imagined as a hollow cavity that testified to her incompleteness. And these ideas, born of ancient Greek and Roman speculation, echoed through medieval universities where students memorized them as unquestionable truth, repeating them in medical treatises that shaped how generations of men regarded their wives, daughters, and patients. A young girl growing into womanhood might never understand her own body, because the men who lectured about it dismissed her as a defective version of themselves, claiming that her colder humors, her moist temperament, and her supposed weakness were marks of inferiority. Such beliefs gave license to endless restrictions, for if a woman was merely an inverted man, then her desires were not her own but a confused mirror of his, and if her reproductive organs were simply internalized male ones, then her fertility could only function properly when guided by masculine will. The implications stretched far beyond dusty books, infiltrating every corner of marriage and society as priests thundered from pulpits that female desire was disorderly and dangerous. Physicians prescribed bizarre cures to correct what they called female defects, and husbands treated their wives not as partners, but as lesser beings whose bodies demanded control. Imagine a young wife lying awake in a cottage while her husband muttered about her supposed deficiencies, while her priest reminded her that her body was a corrupted version of Adam's, and while her village gossiped about whether she could conceive, all built upon a foundation of falsehood disguised as science. In classrooms, young scholars traced diagrams showing the uterus as an inverted scrotum, believing they were glimpsing truth when in fact they were repeating errors. And in courts, judges relied on these same assumptions to decide cases of inheritance, adultery, or rape, often to the destruction of women whose very anatomy was misunderstood. The tragedy of this false science was that it shaped not only medicine but morality, convincing entire communities that women were destined for submission, that their bodies bore the stamp of inferiority, and that their sexuality was a dangerous riddle best controlled by rules, punishments, and endless warnings. Yet despite the weight of these beliefs, women themselves carried their own secret knowledge, passed from mothers to daughters, whispered during childbirth, hidden in herbal remedies, and preserved in folk songs, resisting in quiet ways the notion that they were merely broken men. Still, the official view remained dominant, written in ink across parchment, reinforced in sermons, and repeated at university lecterns, a chorus of authority declaring that the female body was a mistake of nature, a weaker vessel, an inverted form. And so, medieval women lived under the shadow of this misconception, their identities shaped by men who saw them not as whole beings, but as imperfect reflections. Their dignity diminished by a myth that persisted for centuries, a myth so powerful that it colored every judgment of their worth, every expectation of their role, and every limitation placed upon their freedom, until at last, in later generations, new science began to question the old dogma. But for countless wives, daughters, and mothers in the Middle Ages, the damage had already been done, and their lives were lived beneath the crushing weight of being told, again and again, that they were nothing more than inverted men. In the medieval world, where theology and medicine were tangled in a net of superstition and error, one of the most damaging beliefs ever whispered into law was the conviction that female conception required not only the seed of a man, but also the pleasure of a woman. And so scholars, clerics, and judges repeated with frightening certainty that unless a wife or maiden reached orgasm, she could not possibly become pregnant, which meant that if she did conceive, no matter the circumstances, her body itself became the witness against her, a cruel verdict that erased her suffering and transformed violence into supposed consent. Imagine a frightened young woman dragged before a court, her face pale, her hands trembling, as the judge recited learned words from Aristotle or Galen, declaring that since she carried a child, she must have enjoyed the act, and therefore the crime of rape could not stand, because pleasure and pregnancy were considered inseparable. Physicians like Constantine the African had written centuries earlier that women required prolonged stimulation and even multiple climaxes for conception, and these words, meant as clumsy attempts at understanding fertility, hardened into doctrine that weighed on victims like chains. Thus, a brutal assault could be reinterpreted as hidden desire, and a pregnancy born of violence could be twisted into proof of guilt, leaving the victim not only unprotected, but accused of complicity in her own suffering. The terror of this idea spread far beyond the courtroom, shaping how families responded to their daughters, how husbands justified their actions, and how priests instructed women in confession, where the belief that pleasure was necessary for conception erased the possibility of recognizing coercion, leaving women defenseless against both their attackers and the very institutions meant to offer justice. A young girl assaulted in a field might find herself shunned by her neighbors, who pointed to her swelling belly as evidence of her supposed enjoyment, while her attacker boasted that nature itself had cleared him of sin. The law echoed this cruelty, demanding proof that a woman had not experienced pleasure, an impossible burden when pleasure was defined by men who misunderstood or ignored the complexities of the female body. And so the myth spread from parchment to pulpit, from lecture hall to village square, embedding itself in the minds of generations until it seemed not only believable but obvious, an unquestioned truth repeated across Europe. Yet women knew otherwise, whispering to one another in kitchens, at wells during childbirth, that pain and pregnancy could indeed coexist, but their voices carried little weight against the roar of scholars and clerics who wrote their certainties in Latin and stamped them with divine authority. The consequence was a culture where victims were silenced twice, first by the act of violence and then by the judgment that followed, a world where the very biology of reproduction was weaponized against them. Still, despite the cruelty of this belief, women endured, raising children conceived in pain, carving out dignity where society saw only shame, and passing on fragments of knowledge that would one day help unravel the falsehood. Centuries later, science would prove what they always knew, that conception could occur without consent, that pleasure was not required, and that their suffering had been doubly cruel because it was denied. But in the medieval centuries, this single error of medicine and morality poisoned justice, turning the womb itself into an accuser and leaving countless women burdened not only with unwanted pregnancies, but with the unbearable stigma of being told that their very bodies had betrayed them. In the labyrinth of medieval medicine, one of the strangest and most terrifying beliefs was the notion of the wandering womb, a conviction that the uterus was not fixed securely within a woman's body, but was instead a restless organ capable of traveling through her flesh, seeking comfort or escape, and wreaking havoc wherever it roamed, so that physicians solemnly warned that the womb could rise upward to press against the heart and choke out life, or sink downward in a desperate attempt to flee through the vagina, bringing agony or death. For a medieval woman, already burdened by endless rules of church and community, this theory added another layer of fear. For any sudden pain, shortness of breath, or even a fainting spell might be diagnosed as the movement of her rebellious womb, an invisible creature within her, unpredictable and dangerous. Treatments were as bizarre as the diagnosis itself, for doctors prescribed fumigation of the lower body with fragrant herbs and resins to lure the womb gently downward. Or conversely, they would place foul, acrid substances near the nose in hopes of driving the organ away from the head, a tug-of-war of smells where the uterus was imagined like a wild animal responding to bait. Women were instructed to sit over steaming pots of lavender, rosemary, or myrrh, their skirts forming a tent to trap the scented smoke, while attendants fanned the vapors upward as if coaxing a reluctant pet back to its proper place. And when that failed, harsher remedies appeared, including strong vinegar, sulfur, or even burning feathers held beneath the nostrils to disgust the wandering womb into retreat. Such practices blurred the line between medicine and ritual, science and superstition, leaving women as both patients and prisoners of their own bodies. The fear of hysteria, a word born from the Greek hystera, meaning womb, was attached to every manner of female suffering, from melancholy and headaches to seizures and fits of rage, so that nearly any behavior deemed unusual could be blamed on the secret travels of the uterus. Imagine the plight of a young wife who collapses from exhaustion after childbirth, only to be told that her womb is climbing toward her lungs, or a maiden who weeps uncontrollably after a broken betrothal, accused of harboring a restless uterus that must be pacified with smoke and prayer. The wandering womb became not only a medical explanation, but a cultural weapon, reinforcing the idea that women were unstable, ruled by organs beyond their control, in constant need of guidance from husbands, priests, and physicians. This belief excused confinement, justified restrictions, and added weight to the argument that women could not be trusted with independence. For if even their wombs were disobedient, how could they themselves be reliable? Yet beneath this suffocating theory, women still sought their own remedies, using gentle teas of chamomile or mint, warm compresses, or the quiet comfort of other women who recognized that grief, exhaustion, or trauma often lay behind the symptoms, though their wisdom was dismissed by the male authorities who clung to the wandering womb as an explanation for all that they could not understand. The tragedy was that real illnesses went untreated, real pain ignored, because doctors chased an imaginary organ across the body instead of listening to their patients. And in this way, the myth of the wandering womb stole not only dignity, but also health. For centuries, the belief persisted, shaping treatments, sermons, and even legal judgments, until slowly the rise of anatomy and new science began to reveal the truth. But in the dim, candlelit chambers of medieval Europe, countless women lived and died under the shadow of this phantom, told that their very wombs were traitors within them, roaming without rest and reminding them daily that their bodies, like their lives, were never fully their own. In the shadowed villages and bustling towns of the medieval world, where the teachings of priests collided with the desperation of ordinary women, one of the most perilous aspects of daily life was the attempt to control fertility through herbs and concoctions that straddled the thin line between remedy and poison. For without reliable knowledge or safe methods, women turned to pennyroyal, tansy, rue, and countless other plants whispered about in kitchens and forests, each carrying the promise of preventing pregnancy, but also the threat of death if taken in the wrong measure. And since the difference between a helpful dose and a fatal one was often no more than a pinch, a swallow, or a heartbeat, every sip from a steaming cup of bitter tea became a gamble with fate. A mother might pass down a recipe to her daughter, instructing her to boil the leaves beneath a full moon or mix the herbs with honey to disguise the taste, yet always with the warning that one sip too many could still the womb and still the heart together. In marketplaces, women searched for the twisted mandrake root shaped like a tiny human body, believing that worn against the skin it might grant fertility or protect against miscarriage. Though forged imitations carved from bryony were sold at high prices to the desperate, while the church thundered from pulpits that such practices were witchcraft, binding women to the devil and endangering their souls, even as many pious wives secretly clutched amulets beneath their crucifixes, unwilling to abandon the hope of control in a world that offered them none. Some remedies were simple, like jumping backward 7 times after intercourse or drinking wine mixed with ground bees, rituals that carried more symbolism than science, while others turned deadly, calling for mercury, lead, or arsenic, substances that promised to cleanse the womb but more often ravaged the body, leaving behind seizures, blindness, or slow-wasting deaths. The desperation driving these choices was immense, for a pregnancy outside marriage could bring disgrace, exile, or even execution, while within marriage the constant cycle of childbearing carried the looming shadow of maternal mortality, with 1 woman in 3 perishing in childbirth, so that for many the choice between risky contraception and near-certain suffering seemed hardly a choice at all. Imagine a young bride trembling as she swallows a bitter draught, handed to her by a village wise woman, praying that it will prevent conception but fearing the cramps that follow, unsure whether they signal success, failure, or the beginning of her own end, while her husband sleeps unaware beside her, and the night air carries the scent of herbs burned in ritual to ward off harm. Secrecy cloaked these practices, for to speak openly invited accusation, and women gathered in whispers, exchanging knowledge beneath the gaze of suspicious priests, burying afterbirth beneath doorways to ensure future fertility, tucking amber stones between their breasts to guard against miscarriage, blending sacred and profane in a desperate web of survival. The irony was cruel, for even as the Church condemned these methods, it offered no safe alternative, insisting that women submit to the will of God and bear children endlessly, leaving them trapped between spiritual obedience and earthly danger. Yet the ingenuity of women persisted, their knowledge passed quietly from generation to generation, woven into songs, stories, and rituals that blended medicine with magic. The tale of medieval contraception is not merely one of superstition, but of courage, of women willing to risk pain, gossip, and death itself in order to carve a sliver of control over their bodies. For in a world where freedom was denied them at every turn, even the smallest act of choice, whether a sip of tea, a whispered charm, or a hidden root, became a declaration of defiance against the fate imposed by church, husband, and society. A fragile but enduring testament to the resilience of those who sought survival in the perilous space between healing and harm. In the medieval world, a young woman's worth was often measured not by her laughter, her skills, or her heart, but by the fragile membrane of her virginity, for the hymen was elevated to the status of currency, treated as a sacred seal of family honor and the most valuable dowry she could carry into her marriage, more precious than fields, cattle, or gold. And so entire negotiations between families revolved around this intimate proof, with fathers boasting of their daughter's purity as though it were a coin that could be traded, and husbands demanding verification on the wedding night to ensure they had not been deceived. The consummation of a marriage was not merely a private moment, but a public ritual in which blood became evidence, and if the expected stain failed to appear on the sheets, suspicion fell like a hammer, branding the bride as fraudulent, impure, or even criminal. Imagine the terror of a girl scarcely more than 14, standing on her wedding night before a husband twice her age, knowing that the weight of her family's reputation rested on the frail chance that her body would bleed, even though anatomy itself gave no guarantee. For horseback riding, heavy work, or simple natural variation could mean the hymen had torn long before the marriage bed, yet medieval knowledge was too crude to allow such understanding. In many villages, the bloodied sheets were paraded before relatives and neighbors as undeniable proof of honor, while the absence of blood could end in disgrace, annulment, or death, and stories whisper of desperate brides pricking their fingers, smearing chicken blood, or hiding vials of animal fluid to create the illusion demanded by the crowd outside. The pressure was unbearable, for a single night could determine the rest of a woman's life, and her body was treated as evidence in a trial she never agreed to, judged by fathers, husbands, priests, and gossiping villagers. The Church reinforced this obsession, declaring that consummation sealed the sacrament, and until that moment the union was not fully recognized, so couples were thrust into the absurd situation of proving their intimacy to the community, sometimes even to church courts that interrogated spouses separately about the details of their wedding night, examining the woman's body for signs of penetration and questioning neighbors about what sounds they heard through the thin wooden walls. In such a world, virginity was not a personal state, but a public contract, and its proof was demanded with a cruelty that left no room for privacy or tenderness. Men, too, carried burdens, for failure to produce blood could be interpreted as evidence of impotence, a humiliation that struck at their honor, but the greater danger always fell upon the woman, whose body bore the impossible expectation of being both untouched and unbroken, both pure and capable of demonstrating proof. The tragic irony was that medieval science misunderstood the hymen entirely, imagining it as a solid barrier sealing the vagina completely, a veil that had to be torn through intercourse, rather than the delicate flexible tissue that varies greatly among women. And so they believed its absence proved promiscuity beyond question. These misconceptions shaped law, custom, and daily life for centuries, binding women's fates to a myth and silencing them under the weight of honor they could never control. Yet within this suffocating system, resilience still flickered as women whispered advice to one another, prepared secret tricks to survive the wedding night, and carried the memory of injustice as a quiet rebellion. The obsession with virginity reveals not only the cruelty of the era, but also the desperation of families clinging to honor in a world of fragile survival, where a girl's body became the battlefield upon which her reputation, property, and lineage were defended. Her blood, the ink that wrote contracts she never chose to sign, and her silence, the price of preserving her family's fragile standing in the unforgiving theater of medieval life. In medieval Europe, where faith shaped law and law shaped every aspect of intimacy, the consummation of a marriage was not only a personal moment between two people, but a legal requirement that determined whether the union itself was valid. And so, the act of proving consummation became a strange mixture of ritual, interrogation, and public curiosity, transforming the bedroom into a courtroom and the body of the bride into evidence. The Church declared that without sexual union, no matter how grand the ceremony or how rich the dowry, the marriage was incomplete, which meant that families, priests, and even neighbors felt entitled to demand proof. And when doubt arose, church courts took charge, summoning the husband and wife to describe the most intimate details of their wedding night. Their words weighed as testimony in disputes that could decide inheritance, property, and honor. Imagine a frightened young bride, cheeks flushed with shame, being questioned by stern clerics about whether she felt pain, whether there was blood, whether her husband had fulfilled his duty, while her new husband sat in another chamber recounting the same event with his own details, both of them trapped in a humiliating performance where silence could mean annulment and too much honesty could lead to scandal. The court did not hesitate to order physical examinations, subjecting women to invasive inspections meant to confirm penetration, while men accused of impotence might be forced to undergo tests before witnesses, sometimes compelled to display themselves or even attempt intercourse under scrutiny, turning private acts into grotesque public trials. Neighbors, too, were dragged into the process, called to testify about what they heard through the thin wooden walls on the wedding night, whether they caught cries, laughter, or the creak of the marriage bed, as if gossip could serve as legal proof. In some cases, sheets were inspected, stains studied, rumors dissected, and reputations shredded, all in the name of ensuring that marriage had been properly sealed. The consequences were devastating, for a woman whose husband failed to consummate the union might be returned in disgrace to her family, branded as barren, or even accused of witchcraft, while a man judged impotent suffered public humiliation that could strip him of status and inheritance rights. The obsession with consummation created bizarre scenarios in which couples who loved each other but struggled with fertility were dragged into endless hearings, their privacy stolen by priests and judges who claimed to defend morality. The irony was cruel, because the Church taught that desire within marriage should be controlled and passion subdued, yet at the same time, it demanded proof of intercourse as a sacred necessity, forcing couples into a paradox where they had to perform intimacy for validation, but avoid too much pleasure for fear of sin. In this world, intimacy was never truly theirs, always overshadowed by law, by doctrine, by the listening ears of neighbors, and the watchful eyes of authority. A bride who entered her husband's house knew that her body would not belong to her alone, for it was bound up in contracts, family honor, and ecclesiastical law, and her most private experiences could at any moment be turned into evidence. Still, despite the humiliation, couples found ways to endure. some creating secret spaces of tenderness away from the reach of inquisitors, others breaking under the strain of endless judgment, their marriages annulled, their futures destroyed. The practice of legally proving consummation reveals not only the cruelty of medieval institutions, but also the desperation of a society obsessed with legitimacy, lineage, and control, where the laughter or silence behind a closed door could change the fate of families, and where the sacred union of two people was reduced to a trial of flesh, a contract signed in blood, and a verdict delivered not by love, but by the echo of voices outside the bedroom. In the haunted imagination of the medieval world, where every shadow might conceal the devil's hand and every dream could carry a warning from heaven or hell, the belief in sexual demons known as the succubus and the incubus was not dismissed as fantasy, but accepted as sober fact, repeated in sermons, legal records, and medical texts, so that men and women alike lived with the fear that their most private moments of weakness could become an open door for unholy visitors. And these creatures were described in vivid detail. The succubus, a female demon of dark beauty, said to slip into a man's bed at night, straddle his chest, and drain his vitality through lust, leaving him pale and weakened in the morning. His nocturnal emissions or sexual dreams explained not as natural, but as evidence of her unholy embrace. The incubus, her male counterpart, was believed even more dangerous, for he could overpower women in their sleep, forcing himself upon them with strength no mortal could resist. And if a woman conceived afterward, her child was thought cursed, half human and half demonic, destined for misfortune or even monstrous deformity. Theologians, eager to map the workings of evil, spun elaborate theories, insisting that the succubus first took seed from men, then transformed into an incubus to implant it into unsuspecting women, thus corrupting the human bloodline with infernal offspring. And these terrifying notions were taught not only in cloisters, but in universities, where students copied them diligently, spreading fear from parchment to pulpit to hearthside. Imagine a village woman waking in the dead of night, frozen by the crushing weight of sleep paralysis. Her chest heavy, her breath shallow, certain that the incubus sat upon her rib cage, stealing her strength, while her husband and children slept nearby, oblivious. And in the morning, when she confessed her terror to the priest, he might declare her a victim of demonic assault or, worse, accuse her of inviting the devil with hidden sins. In this way, the line between victim and witch was perilously thin, for a woman who spoke too openly of nightly visitations risked being branded a seductress in league with hell, while men who admitted to sexual dreams were told they had consorted with succubi, their very masculinity undermined by invisible lovers. Rituals of protection multiplied, with holy water sprinkled on beds, crucifixes hung above doors, prayers whispered before sleep. And yet the fear persisted, because no one could be sure that their defenses would hold against spirits that slipped through walls and shadows. Physicians, too, tried to offer remedies, recommending cold baths, bloodletting, or strange diets meant to balance the humors and ward off nocturnal visitations, but their advice often mingled with superstition, leaving sufferers no more secure. Even natural phenomena like sleep paralysis, now understood as a quirk of the nervous system, was interpreted as proof of the incubus pressing down on the chest, and those who woke paralyzed and terrified carried the memory as evidence of demonic assault. Stories circulated of monks tempted in their cells by succubi disguised as maidens, of noblewomen tormented by invisible lovers, of peasants whose children bore deformities blamed on infernal seed, and each tale reinforced the certainty that demons lurked closest when bodies were most vulnerable. Fear of these beings seeped into law, with some courts questioning whether accused witches had lain with incubi, and into art, where manuscripts depicted grotesque figures crouched over sleeping victims. The terror was not only personal, but collective, for communities believed that demonic unions could curse entire villages with famine, plague, or storm, and so victims were often shunned, punished, or even executed, their suffering twisted into guilt. Yet within this culture of dread, resilience flickered, for people still sought comfort in charms, whispered prayers, and the solidarity of others who admitted the same terrors, proving that even in the grip of superstition, humans reached for connection. The legacy of the succubus and incubus reveals not only how medieval people explained the mysteries of dreams and desire, but also how fear could transform natural experiences into instruments of control, keeping men wary of their thoughts, women ashamed of their bodies, and everyone convinced that intimacy was a battlefield where demons prowled, invisible but ever present, ready to turn pleasure into peril and night into a theater of dread. In the medieval imagination, menstruation was not seen as a natural cycle, but as a monthly eruption of danger, a flow of blood believed to carry poison capable of withering crops, souring wine, rusting iron, driving animals mad, and even sapping the strength from men who dared to touch a woman during her bleeding. And so the monthly rhythm of half the population was wrapped in fear, shame, and superstition, turning something ordinary into something monstrous. Learned authorities from antiquity such as Pliny the Elder were still quoted with reverence, declaring that menstrual blood dulled the edge of knives and drove dogs into frenzy, and medieval scholars copied these claims into their own texts, teaching young physicians and priests that a menstruating woman was dangerous to everyone around her. The Church added its own weight to the stigma, teaching that menstruation was the divine punishment inflicted upon Eve's daughters for her original sin, a visible reminder of female guilt, and therefore women during their monthly cycle were often forbidden from entering churches, touching sacred objects, or even preparing food for their families, as though their very presence contaminated holiness and nourishment alike. In some villages, women were isolated in small huts outside the community during their bleeding, forced to endure the cold and loneliness while others carried on with daily life. And though not all regions practiced such strict separation, the suspicion followed everywhere, whispered behind backs and reinforced by sermons that painted menstruation as shameful. Imagine a young wife on her wedding night, terrified not only of her husband, but of the timing of her body, praying that her first cycle would not betray her at such a crucial moment, for she knew that blood outside the expected ritual of consummation could mark her as unclean rather than pure. Physicians, trapped in the framework of humoral theory, insisted that menstrual blood was a way of balancing excess fluids, and if it failed to flow properly, it would corrupt the body from within, leading to hysteria, fevers, or even death. And so they prescribed bloodletting, purges, and harsh treatments to restore balance, further weakening already vulnerable women. Some doctors even recommended sexual intercourse as a cure, arguing that male seed could neutralize the toxicity of menstrual blood, a claim that blurred healing with coercion and reinforced the idea that a woman's body was defined only through male presence. Yet against this tide of fear, women crafted their own private wisdom, quietly developing ways to manage their cycles in secrecy, using moss, cloth rags, or sheepskins as crude protection, learning to track their flow by the phases of the moon, and brewing teas of chamomile or yarrow to soothe cramps. Mothers passed this hidden knowledge to daughters in whispers, guarding it from the scrutiny of priests who might condemn such practices as witchcraft. And in these small acts of care, women carved out a fragile space of solidarity and dignity. Still, the larger culture continued to bind menstruation to shame, treating women as dangerous polluters rather than human beings, so that every month they carried not only the physical burden of their cycle, but also the social burden of suspicion. The irony was cruel, for in reality, menstruation was evidence of fertility, the very foundation upon which family survival depended, yet, instead of being honored, it was condemned, turned into a mark of impurity. Art and literature reinforced the fear, describing menstruating women as unpredictable, their tempers blamed on their blood, their illnesses explained by its failure to flow, and so the myth of the poisonous womb continued to shape perceptions century after century. Yet through it all, women endured, navigating the silence, the exile, and the danger, keeping their secret remedies alive and preserving the truth that their bodies, though misunderstood, were strong enough to carry both life and stigma. The story of medieval menstruation is therefore not only one of fear and ignorance, but also one of resilience, where the quiet courage of women stood against the roar of superstition, and where every hidden rag, every whispered remedy, and every shared story of survival became an act of defiance against a culture that insisted their blood was deadly, when in truth it was simply life itself. In the turbulent landscape of medieval justice, where honor mattered more than fairness and status determined punishment, sexual crimes were judged not by the suffering of the victim, but by the standing of the men connected to her, creating a system where a woman's body became a battlefield of hierarchy and power. And so, rape was defined not as an act against the woman herself, but as a crime against her father, her husband, or her lord, for she was considered their property, and her violation was an insult to their authority rather than a wound upon her own soul. In practice, this meant that if a nobleman forced himself upon a peasant woman, the penalty might be no more than a fine, a handful of coins exchanged for her dignity. While if a lowly man dared assault a noblewoman, he risked the rack, mutilation, or death by hanging, because the true crime was not the violence, but the presumption of violating someone of higher status. Adultery, too, was weighted with inequality, for a married woman who strayed could be killed outright by her husband without consequence, her body discarded as proof of his honor, defended, while men were free to seek pleasure with servants, prostitutes, or unmarried girls without fear of the law. The codes were written with brutal clarity, granting men power and excusing their indulgences, while binding women with silence and terror so that even suspicion could ruin a life, a whisper of impropriety enough to end a marriage or condemn a girl to disgrace. Imagine a frightened wife, accused of infidelity, dragged before neighbors who demanded judgment, her husband brandishing his right to strike her down on the spot, the priest murmuring prayers not for her safety, but for his authority, and the crowd watching in grim acceptance because the law itself blessed his violence. Men who could not perform their marital duties faced humiliation in courts that examined their potency. But their failures were treated as weakness rather than sin, while women bore the far sharper edge of judgment, their bodies inspected, their reputations shredded, their voices drowned by the voices of men who decided their fate. The cruelty of this system lay not only in its punishments, but in its double standards, where the same act was excused in one man and condemned in another, depending on the bloodlines of those involved, and where a woman's protest counted for nothing if it clashed with the interests of powerful men. Communities reinforced these values through gossip and ritual, branding women with shame while allowing men to laugh off their exploits, creating a culture where female chastity was guarded like treasure, but female suffering was ignored like dust. The law became both weapon and shield, protecting men from disgrace while exposing women to danger, its codes copied into manuscripts that priests read aloud, its judgments carried into villages where they hardened into unshakable truths. Yet, despite the cruelty, women sought quiet forms of resistance, whispering warnings to daughters, teaching them how to avoid dangerous men, or creating stories that veiled their anger in allegory and song. And in these hidden acts of survival, they challenged the system in the only ways they could. Still, the weight of inequality pressed down on every household, every marriage, every community, reminding women that their safety depended not on justice, but on the whim of fathers and husbands, and reminding men that their honor could be defended not by kindness, but by blood. This harsh imbalance reveals how deeply power was tied to sexuality in the Middle Ages, how the law itself became a mirror of hierarchy, and how ordinary lives were scarred by rules that valued rank above truth, silence above voice, and property above personhood, leaving behind a legacy of fear and submission that echoes even now in the long struggle for equality and dignity. Beneath the stern sermons of priests and the watchful gaze of neighbors, medieval Europe nurtured a hidden world where desire slipped past dogma, a shadow culture of secret laughter, whispered tales, and forbidden experiments that flourished in the cracks of repression. For while the church thundered against lust and declared that only one holy position on rare, permitted nights could keep souls safe, men and women still found ways to bend their bodies and their rules, creating an underground intimacy that existed alongside the rigid codes of salvation. This clandestine culture revealed itself in fablio, bawdy comic tales recited by traveling minstrels in smoky taverns, where peasants chuckled at stories of cunning wives tricking jealous husbands, of priests seducing girls beneath altars, of lovers tangled in positions that theologians had condemned. And though such tales were officially sinful, they spread like wildfire, their humor acting as both entertainment and rebellion, mocking the very authorities who tried to control desire. Imagine a crowded market square where a jester chants a scandalous poem describing a noblewoman on top of her knight, the crowd roaring with laughter while a priest scowls from a distance, powerless to silence every voice, for the hunger for amusement outweighed the fear of damnation. Literature became a mirror of this secret world, with poets like Andreas Capellanus writing about courtly love in the 12th century, slipping into descriptions of caresses and kisses that would have shocked bishops, suggesting that among nobles at least, intimacy was far richer and more experimental than official doctrine allowed. In quiet chambers, away from the ears of priests, couples defied the rigid calendar, joining in Lent or on Sundays, whispering that God surely had greater concerns than their bed. And when passion rose, they dared to try positions whispered in stories, laughing at the idea that an angel stood ready to condemn them. The underground culture also lived in songs, sung by shepherds and maidens in the fields, carrying verses that celebrated love in its playful, sensual form, far from the heavy chains of sin and duty. Women, too, shared their own secret knowledge, passing on advice about how to enjoy intimacy, how to encourage affection, how to disguise pleasure so that priests and husbands would not accuse them of excess. And in these hushed conversations, they carved out space for themselves, tiny sanctuaries of honesty amid the silence imposed by law. Even art hinted at rebellion, with marginalia and manuscripts showing monks chased by naked women, rabbits mounting hunters, or grotesque figures in impossible embraces, sly jokes sketched by bored scribes who dared to give shape to the desires that official texts denied. Yet this world was always perilous, for discovery could mean excommunication, exile, or worse, and so secrecy was the shield, humor the disguise, and story the weapon. Still, the very persistence of this culture proved that desire could never be fully erased, for every regulation produced its countersong, every law its whispered joke, every sermon its quiet defiance, until the air of medieval Europe seemed divided between the heavy incense of the church and the earthy laughter of the people. The coexistence of repression and rebellion reveals not only the cruelty of control but also the resilience of human nature, which insists on pleasure even when wrapped in chains, which finds joy even in fear, which laughs in the face of rules written to erase laughter. And so the medieval underground of intimacy was more than simple disobedience. It was a declaration that the body belonged not only to priests, not only to husbands, not only to law, but to the individuals who lived within it. A fragile, hidden truth passed in jokes, in poems, in songs, and in stolen touches beneath the relentless shadow of authority. In the villages and castles of medieval Europe, fertility was never treated as a private matter between husband and wife, but as the destiny of entire families and communities. And so, a dense web of rituals, charms, and superstitions grew around the act of reproduction, creating a world where the body was both sacred vessel and battleground of hope, fear, and control. For without children, there was no future, no inheritance, no workers for the fields, and no continuation of the family line. And so every couple was surrounded by ceremonies meant to ensure conception and safe birth. Wedding nights were framed not only as proof of virginity, but as the beginning of fertility, with beds sprinkled with grain and nuts to invite abundance, holy water sprinkled by priests to sanctify the act, and secret herbs tucked under the mattress by midwives to encourage pregnancy. While outside the chamber, neighbors watched eagerly, for the success of one union often meant more stability for the whole village. Beyond the marriage bed, ancient pagan traditions lingered stubbornly, disguised as Christian festivals, and none more so than May Day, when young men and women slipped into forests under the pretense of gathering flowers and returned with cheeks flushed and baskets heavy, for everyone knew that these woodland frolics were as much about pleasure as about petals, and the children born 9 months later often testified to the power of springtime celebrations. The church tried again and again to suppress these rituals, denouncing May games as sinful, warning against the wreaths and dances that carried unmistakable sexual symbolism. Yet the customs persisted because they promised joy and freedom in a life otherwise ruled by toil and fear. Imagine a girl crowned May Queen, her hair braided with wildflowers, leading the procession to raise the maypole, a towering symbol of fertility planted in the earth, around which dancers wove bright ribbons, a living metaphor of union and creation, watched by elders who frowned, yet secretly remembered their own youth. In the countryside, women gathered herbs beneath the full moon, plucking pennyroyal or tansy to prevent conception, mandrake roots to increase it, and rue to guard against miscarriage. A dangerous practice, for the line between medicine and poison was so thin that a mismeasured cup of tea could kill as easily as it could heal. But desperation left little room for caution. Charms blended the sacred with the profane, as women prayed to Saint Margaret for safe delivery while burying afterbirth beneath the threshold to ensure future fertility, or wore crucifixes to church while hiding amber stones between their breasts to ward off miscarriage, creating a secret duality where faith and folk magic lived side by side. Men, too, sought reassurance, consulting astrologers who promised that the stars at the moment of conception would determine not only the sex of the child but his fate, whether he would be a soldier, a scholar, or a disappointment, and noble families paid richly for such advice, convinced that the heavens themselves could be persuaded to bless their line. Yet the desperation for fertility also opened the door to cruelty. For barren women were whispered about as cursed, suspected of witchcraft, or discarded by husbands who believed their wives' wombs were defective, even though medieval medicine did not understand that men too could be infertile. For women, the pressure was relentless, every missed period scrutinized, every miscarriage mourned in whispers of failure, every successful birth celebrated as proof of divine favor. And still, the danger of childbirth hovered like a shadow. For 1 woman in 3 died in or after labor, reminding everyone that fertility carried not only hope, but peril. Still, couples clung to rituals, dancing in spring fields, sprinkling their beds with holy water, whispering charms into the night, and in these acts, they revealed both fear and resilience. For in a world where survival depended on children, they sought every tool, every prayer, every herb, and every story to tilt fate in their favor, proving that fertility was not merely biology, but a sacred drama in which love, superstition, and desperation intertwined, binding human desire to the cycles of earth, sky, and faith.